For centuries, shellac was widely considered to be the best finish for wood in the world. Then, modern finish manufacturers convinced us that shellac was old-fashioned. That's what your grandfather used. The modern woodworker uses polyurethane. I'm not here to bash polyurethane. It has its place for sure. But many woodworkers have forgotten why shellac is such a great finish. So today I'm going to explain why you should be using it, how you should be using it, and when you should be using it. There are other videos about shellac out there, but this is the best one you're going to watch because I'm going to answer a lot of questions others seem to ignore. And by the end of this video, I can almost guarantee that you're going to want to get out in your shop and put shellac on something. First of all, why would you want to use shellac as a wood finish? Well, for one thing, it is fast and really easy to apply. You just wipe it on. It's hard to mess up because it dissolves itself. So you can fix a run that you may have missed on a later coat. There is also no drying time to speak of. Shellac dries so quickly that you can often start the next coat right after the previous one is finished. That means completing the entire finishing process can take just a few minutes or a few hours depending on the size of the project instead of a few days like other finishes. Shellac will also adhere to almost any other finish, and almost any other finish will adhere to it as long as it's de-waxed. For example, some folks like to put it over tung oil or boiled linseed oil for extra protection. Others put polyurethane over shellac. It doesn't matter if it's water or oil-based, it's going to stick. Because shellac dissolves with alcohol, it is very easy to repair even many years down the road. It's also safe for the environment. It's the excretion of the lac beetle, and it contains no petroleum products. In fact, pure shellac is used as a food coating. It's why your M&Ms melt in your mouth and not in your hands. It also smells nice. It's great for inside drawers or cabinets. If you put natural oil in that, sometimes it can smell a little rancid, or petroleum can give up an unpleasant odor when you open the drawer. Finally, shellac comes in different colors. You have light blonde, orange, deep brown. It all depends on the type of tree that the beetle was eating. You can use these colors to your advantage to give life to dull kiln-dried walnut or to add a mellow aged look to lighter woods like pine or maple. You can even add aniline dyes to create your own custom wood stains. So to summarize, shellac is one of the most beautiful, fastest to apply, hardest to mess up, simplest to repair, and easiest to clean up finishes out there. So why isn't everyone using shellac on every project? Well, part of the reason is that it doesn't produce a bulletproof plasticky shell like polyurethane or other modern finishes. Shellac can be durable. It's been used for centuries on floors. But because alcohol will dissolve it, it's not a great finish for a tabletop, for example. But I think the real reason shellac isn't more widely used anymore is because a lot of people are just afraid of it, which is strange because it's so easy to use. But they see folks using digital scales to weigh piles of flakes and carefully measuring alcohol, and they think it's easy to screw up. It's not. It's actually really simple if you understand just a few things. So let me go through them. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you how to make shellac from the flakes. But I think the easiest way to get started using shellac for your first time is to just buy the pre-mixed cans. Most stores sell these in two versions. One is labeled Seal Coat, and the other is just labeled shellac. Now you could finish your entire project with either of these. They're both pure shellac, but there are some differences that you need to know about. Seal Coat is extra thin shellac. In professional terms, this would be considered a 2-pound cut, which is equivalent to 2 pounds of flakes dissolved in 1 gallon of water. It's extra thin so it'll soak deeply into the wood fibers and harden. That'll partially seal the surface of wood, and so some people take advantage of that to keep wood from absorbing stain and blotching. That's why it's sometimes called sanding sealer. But it's not just good for undercoating wood when you intend to apply stain. You can use this for your entire wood finish. It'll just take more coats to build up your protective film. The can labeled shellac contains a higher concentration. It's a 3-pound cut, which is equivalent to 3 pounds of shellac flakes dissolved in 1 gallon of water. This is 50% then more concentrated than the Seal Coat, but it's not usually used in its full strength anyway. Most people will dilute this with about 30 to 50% alcohol, depending on how thin you want your coats to be. You'll develop your own preference over time, but as a general guide for a new user, I would say consider this, the seal coat, ready to use out of the can, and consider the regular shellac to be a concentrate that you thin. Now, since denatured alcohol, which is what you use to thin it, is relatively cheap, the concentrate may be cheaper in the long run. But if you have a hard time finding good pure alcohol where you live, then the ready-to-go seal coat may be your better choice when you're just starting out. Now, there is another difference between the two cans other than their concentration. Natural shellac contains wax. That's fine if all you plan putting over a coat of shellac is another coat of shellac or a paste wax. But if you want to put something else on top, like a stain or a lacquer or a polyurethane, you have to have de-waxed shellac. Out of these two, only the seal coat version is de-waxed. This one is not. You can put this over another type of finish, but you can't put another type of finish over this. Another thing to consider when buying canned shellac is the shelf life. They say it'll last 3 years in the sealed can, I think less once after you open it. The older it is, the slower it's going to cure. So some woodworkers consider it bad after just a few months, while others may tolerate it longer. As a rule, don't buy it until you need it. And if you have some left over, put a date on it. If you still have it 6 months after you opened it, then you should test it on some scrap wood before you use it again. To test it, just put a coat on a piece of wood and then let the alcohol dry, and if it still feels tacky for quite a few minutes afterwards, then maybe you need to throw it away. Since the shelf life on a can of shellac unsealed is 3 years, you really should know how old it is when you buy it off the store shelf. Zinsser has a code that they use for their dates, but it can be cracked. Here's how you do it. The first letter identifies the plant it was made in, so ignore that. The first number is the last digit of the year in which it was made. In this case, there's a 9, so it was made in 2019. The second number is the month of the year. This is an 8 for August. But on this can, notice it has a D instead of a number. That's because December is the 12th month, and instead of squeezing an extra digit in there, they switched to the first letter of the month for those last 3. So O for October, N for November, D for December. Finally, the last 2 numbers are the day within the month. So this can was packaged in 2019, month of August, 14th day of the month. It's a little over 3 years old, so I'm going to have to test it before I use it. Shellac flakes eliminate the shelf life issue because in flake form, this will pretty much last forever provided you keep them in a cool place out of the sun. Once you dissolve the flakes in alcohol, the clock does start ticking, and they will go bad in about 6 months. But you have the ability to make as little or as much as you need for the project at hand, so you're going to waste a lot less by buying the flakes and dissolving them yourself. And it's really not that difficult. Let me show you how to do it. I like to use a 2-pound cut. Technically, that means 2 pounds of flakes dissolved in 1 gallon of alcohol, but I never need a whole gallon of finish. So I break it down using a 4-to-1 formula. What that means is I want 4 times the liquid measurement in ounces of alcohol as I do the weight measurement in ounces of flakes. Volume for liquid, weight for flakes. For example, if I want to make a quart of shellac, I'll mix 32 ounces of alcohol with 8 ounces of flakes because 8 times 4 is 32. It's actually going to make a little more than a quart because the flakes take up space even after they dissolve, but the formula is 4-to-1. Likewise, a pint is 16 ounces of alcohol, so I would want 4 ounces of flakes because 4 times 4 is 16. Knowing how much to make so that you don't end up with too little or too much for your project is going to take a little experience. You go through a lot more shellac than you would polyurethane because so much of it is alcohol, which evaporates away. But if you're mixing it yourself for the first time, I'd start with a small amount on a small project just to see how much you use. Perhaps a half pint. Now that's 8 ounces of alcohol, and using the 4-to-1 ratio, 2 ounces of flakes. I'm using an inexpensive postal scale, and I'm telling it to ignore the weight of the jar on top. Then I add the 2 ounces of shellac flakes. I like zebra shellac flakes because they're de-waxed and they're pure. Not a lot of gunk, bug butts, that kind of stuff in it. You can find cheaper flakes on Amazon, sometimes a lot cheaper, but keep in mind, they are not de-waxed unless they specifically say so. Now once I weigh my flakes, I like to pulverize them in a coffee grinder. This isn't required. You can dissolve them just as they are. But the finer the flakes, the faster they're going to dissolve, significantly faster in my experience. So I like to grind them into a powder. Shellac isn't toxic, but I don't want bits of coffee grounds in my finish, so I keep an inexpensive grinder in my shop dedicated to this purpose. Many jars have liquid measuring scales on the sides, so I'm using that to measure 8 ounces of alcohol. I'm using denatured alcohol. You can get this in the paint department of many hardware stores. Some places also sell it in the camping department as fuel. Most denatured alcohol works well enough, but some brands put a lot of water in it, up to like 20%. Excess water will increase the time it takes your flakes to dissolve, and too much water can give you a streaky finish. If you're having problems like that, or if you can't buy denatured alcohol where you live, you may have to find another source. What you want is the purest alcohol you can get. Some have used isopropyl alcohol from the pharmacy. Keep in mind that they make different grades. Rubbing alcohol, for example, is full of water. Stay away from that. But some pharmacies sell a version of isopropyl that is 90% or more purity. That is going to do the job. The third option is high-proof, clear grain alcohol from the liquor store. Look for something that's over 180 proof. 190 proof Everclear, for example, is an excellent solvent for shellac if you can buy it where you live and keep yourself from drinking it. This solution has to be stirred as it dissolves, especially in the early stages. I'll shake it every few minutes until most of the sludge at the bottom is gone. It's not going to take too long if you ground your flakes up. After that, it can sit overnight, but bring it in the house if it's cold in the shop. Shellac dissolves better in temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. If you really want to speed things up, besides grinding the flakes and upping the temperature, you might get one of these. This is a magnetic mixer, such as may be used in a chemistry lab. They really aren't very expensive, and I use them to mix all my clear finishes, not just my shellac. Once the worst of the sludge is dissolved at the bottom, drop that little magnetic tablet in the jar and turn it on. It'll mix continuously and dissolve the flakes a lot quicker. I got this idea from Chris Shores over at Lost Art Press. This half pint of shellac with the pulverized powdered flakes, and it's warm in here, over 60 degrees, and I used the magnetic stir, and it was completely dissolved in just a couple hours. I'm going to put a link below to a coffee grinder, an inexpensive but pretty good scale, and to that mixer if you're interested. Look for them by expanding the video description area below or pinned to the top of the comments. Now, applying shellac couldn't be easier. You just wipe on a thin coat. You can do it with a brush if you like, but I prefer a soft cloth or an old t-shirt, or you can make an applicator. Take a few cotton balls and wrap them inside a small piece of cloth. You want it to be relatively dense but not rock hard by any means. Make sure there's no wrinkles or folds and tie it off. Applicators like these have been used to apply shellac for centuries. Soak up some finish and wipe it on the surface. The great thing about shellac is it dries so quickly. The alcohol flashes off in really just a few seconds. As it does, it'll feel cool. So if you want to know how fast a batch that you just made is going to dry in the conditions that you have in your shop, put a little bit on a scrap of wood and then touch it to your cheek. When it's cool, it means it's still evaporating. Once it's not cool anymore, the alcohol is gone and it'll just take probably a minute or two for the shellac to harden. When it's not sticky anymore, it's time to recoat. In fact, on all but the tiniest projects, you can usually start your next coat as soon as you finish the last one. Shellac is going to raise the grain a little bit on the initial coat. If the surface doesn't feel smooth after that first coat, you can sand it lightly with some 600 grit paper. You shouldn't have to do that after subsequent coats, just after the first one. Keep in mind that alcohol will redissolve even cured shellac, so the next coat will partially dissolve the last one. This means that all the layers essentially meld together into a single film. It's one of the reasons shellac finishes are so clear and beautiful. It also makes it possible to fix a run if you missed it and don't find it until the next coat, even after it's dried. but it's a good idea to avoid rubbing too much as you apply a new coat so you don't pull up the previous ones. I like to just go back and forth or maybe even in one direction. You'll know if you're doing it too much because it'll start to stick to your pad. A good shellac finish is built up through many thin coats. Generally, you're going to apply at least twice as many coats of shellac compared to other unthinned finishes like polyurethane. For objects that aren't handled too much, 5 or 6 coats is probably enough. For tabletops and floors, you may need a dozen coats or more. The more coats you apply, the shinier the surface will become. If you don't want a high gloss, you can sand the last coat back with some very high grit sandpaper to produce a more matte appearance. I usually like to rub some paste wax on mine with extra fine steel wool. Then I give it a buff with a soft cloth and it gives me a nice satin look. Cleanup is a breeze. If you have finish left, seal it in a jar and write the date on it as well as the concentration and the color of the shellac. The applicator can be saved and used again as well. Even if it hardens, more alcohol is just going to re-soften it. And that's all there is to it. You know pretty much everything you need to know about shellac. I recommend saving this video to your favorites for future reference. It's loaded with tips. And check the description below for a playlist on other finishing tutorials I've made. But before you do, I think you're going to want to see this. For the last several years, I've been replacing my cheap drill and Forstner bits with quality bits from Fish Tools. They're a family-run company that still forges their bits the old-fashioned way. Try replacing your most used bits with Fish bits using the links in the notes below this video, and you'll see why I love them so much.